We have to start with the War of 1812, especially with August of 1814, when British troops captured and burned the nation's capital. After the War of 1812, the United States government realized how weak the national defenses were and the United States military. So after the war, they began a program where they were looking at improving the Army, reorganizing it, and improving the nation's seacoast defenses. One of the things they elected to do was to build a system of new forts along the United States coastline to protect the nation against another potential invasion from the sea. Charleston Harbor was selected to receive one of those new forts. And in 1828, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came down and surveyed the area and selected the spot where you are today to build a new fort to protect the city of Charleston and the harbor of Charleston as well. They would begin a program where in 1829 they would start laying approximately 70,000 tons of rock and granite rubble on this site to make a man-made island, or an artificial island, standing about 5 feet above the surface of the harbor and 2.5 acres in size. That project would continue on with the building of the fort, the brick fort that you see here today, or the remnants of the brick fort that you see here today. The fort was originally would have 5-foot thick exterior walls, stand almost 50 feet above the surface of the water of Charleston Harbor, and mount 3 tiers of cannons on 4 of the 5 principal walls of the fort. Fort Sumter is a pentagon, or 5-sided shaped structure. The base wall or back wall of the fort is called the gorge wall. But then on the 4 principal walls, though, that face the shipping channel out to the Atlantic Ocean, across to Fort Moultrie, and then into Charleston Harbor itself and facing the city, there were 3 tiers of cannons here. That's what the design was. A first, second, and third or barbette tier. The fort was designed to hold 135 guns within its walls and have living quarters inside for 650 officers and men. By 1860, Fort Sumter was about 90% complete. Construction would stop December 20th of 1860 when South Carolina seceded from the Union. So Fort Sumter would never be complete in its original design. With South Carolina's secession on December 20th of 1860, the situation in Charleston Harbor was Fort Sumter being a construction site, Castle Pinckney, located in the mouth of the Cooper River on Chutes Folly Island near the city, only had an ordnance sergeant staffing that installation. Fort Johnson, across the way to the west of Fort Sumter on James Island, had been abandoned since the 1820s. The only garrison fortification in Charleston Harbor was Fort Moultrie, located just over a mile away from where we are here at Fort Sumter on Sullivan's Island. There was Major Robert Anderson with 2 incomplete companies of the 1st U.S. Artillery Regiment and the Regimental Band. Counting Major Anderson, about 84 officers and men were at his disposal or under his command at Fort Moultrie. Realizing that position was indefensible, on the night of December 26, 1860, he moved his command from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter, and there start putting the fort in the best state of defense that he could. 15 cannon had already been mounted in the fort before, and with he and his garrison there, they would mount at least 45 more guns, giving it a complement of 60 cannons available for use in an upcoming engagement. Unfortunately, though, with only about 84 officers and men, the largest number of guns he could man at any one time was 15. So he had all these guns at his disposal, but only 15 that he could really use at any one time. After this, with South Carolina's secession, South Carolina forces took over Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, brought Fort Johnson back online as an installation, and built other installations of earth and sand on Sullivan's Island, Mount Pleasant, James Island, and on Morris Island as well. And as more states seceded from the Union, making the Confederate States of America as we get into January and February of 1861, this would all come under the jurisdiction of the Confederate States of America. General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard was brought over to place in command of the Confederate defenses here and to direct what would end up being the bombardment of Fort Sumter. After repeated attempts by the Confederate government to negotiate with the administration of President James Buchanan and then President Abraham Lincoln after his inauguration on March 4, 1861, these negotiations failed. with the word that a relief expedition has been ordered to Fort Sumter by President Lincoln. The Confederate government under President Jefferson Davis sends messages or word over to General Beauregard to demand the evacuation or surrender of Fort Sumter. Beauregard sends emissaries out demanding this evacuation surrender. Major Anderson refuses until he receives orders from his government to evacuate, or he is starved out. And then the Confederate emissaries then tell him that then they will open fire on him at 4:30 in the morning on April 12th of 1861. These Confederate emissaries row over to Fort Johnson on James Island, and from that spot is directed the firing of the first shot of the war. At 4:30 in the morning, a 10-inch mortar shell is fired from Fort Johnson at Fort Sumter. It explodes over the top of the fort. That's the signal for every Confederate gun that can bear on Fort Sumter to open fire. 43 heavy guns and mortars go into action from the north in Mount Pleasant, from the south on Cummings Point on Morris Island, to the east in Fort Moultrie and other Confederate batteries there on Sullivan's Island, and from the west from Fort Johnson. They will fire on the fort continuously for approximately 34 hours, firing over 3,000 rounds of heavy ammunition at the fort. Fort Sumter's walls will hold up well under this bombardment. None of the artillery projectiles will penetrate its 5-foot thick brick walls. What will force Fort Sumter's surrender is hot shot, solid cast iron cannonballs heated in furnaces until they became red hot, loaded in mortars that, at a high angle fire, come up over the walls of the fort, come crashing down through the roofs of the barracks buildings and officer quarters, and set them on fire. These fires are burning down towards the powder magazine in the fort, where there's 15,000 pounds of black powder. Major Anderson then has to make the decision, do I continue to fight my guns, or do I fight the fires? And he elects to fight the fires. That allows Confederate emissaries to come over, surrenders negotiated, and Fort Sumter is officially evacuated and surrendered on April 14, 1861, bringing an end to this first major combat action of the American Civil War. And remarkably, no one was killed on either side during this first major bombardment. Anderson is allowed to evacuate and go north with his troops. The Confederates come in and repair the damages and put Fort Sumter in the best state of defense that they can. The fort will never be completed, but the Confederates will mount at least 90 cannons in the fort and have a garrison of up to 500 Confederate soldiers in the fort over the course of the war. There's relatively easy duty in the fort over the next 2 years. There's no major combat or any actions at the fort until April of 1863. The next major event in the history of Fort Sumter occurs on April 7, 1863, which is generally known as the Ironclad Attack. On that date, April 7, 1863, 9 U.S. warships, ironclad vessels, are going to come up and attack Fort Sumter. This is going to make United States naval history and United States history in general, because for the first time in the history of the United States Navy and the United States of America, a fleet of ironclad vessels are going to go into battle. It's going to be early afternoon on April 7, 1863, and they're going to come steaming up the main shipping channel, which paralleled Morris Island. Inside the fort is about 500 Confederate soldiers from the 1st South Carolina Artillery Regiment of Regulars, and about 90 guns are mounted in the fort. As the Union warships are coming up the channel, one of the Confederate outlooks sees these warships and goes down to the officers' mess, where there's Colonel Albert Rhett and his senior officers are sitting down to a late noonday meal. They get word that the Union gunboats are coming, and Colonel Rhett comes up on the parapet of Fort Sumter, looks out in the distance, sees the Union warships, and turns to his officers and says, "Gentlemen, we can return to our noonday meal." And so the officers return to the officers' mess, complete their noonday meal 20 or 30 minutes later, and Colonel Rhett comes up on the parapet of Fort Sumter, calls out for the regimental band. As the regimental band plays Dixie, and he raises the regimental colors, the national colors of the Confederacy and the South Carolina flag, they fire a 13-gun salute, one for each state of the Confederacy, and the battle officially opens about 2:30 or so in the afternoon. The battle's going to last about 2.5 hours, and over the course of that battle, at least 4 of the Union warships are going to be seriously damaged. The USS Keokuk will come in closest. She will receive at least 90 direct hits, of which 15 will penetrate her armor, and she will limp out of action and sink the next day off Morris Island. This is a bad day for the United States Navy. The United States naval fleet is defeated. But in conjunction with the 90 guns in Fort Sumter, we also have the Confederate guns on Morris Island, the ones over on Sullivan's Island and Fort Moultrie. And the Confederates have done something which was common in this time period, had been around for many years. The Confederates have gone out and removed all the channel markers. Why show the enemy where the channel is? And they have put aiming buoys out in the channel as well. So from their various artillery positions around the mouth of Charleston Harbor, Sullivan's Island, Morris Island, and from Fort Sumter, they have done artillery practice in the years previous to this.